This is a 2020 Lamborghini Huracan Evo Spider, and it's the newest version of the Huracan, which is Lamborghini's entry-level sports car. The Evo is essentially an evolution of the Huracan, replacing the standard model that's been on sale since 2015. And today, I'm going to review this car and show you what makes it so impressive. I've borrowed this Huracan Evo Spider from O'Gara, San Diego, which is also Lamborghini San Diego, which is of course the Lamborghini dealership here in the San Diego area. Lamborghini San Diego has all of the latest Lamborghini models, including the tremendously popular Urus SUV and the Huracan Evo, which has just started to go on sale in Spider form. So let's talk Huracan. Like I mentioned, the Huracan came out back in 2015, and since then it's used a 5.2-liter V10 that makes about 600 horsepower. The Huracan Evo replaces the standard original Huracan, and it's offered as a coupe or as a convertible like this car, which is called the Spider. It keeps the V10, but power is jacked up to 630 horsepower. That's the same power figure as the Huracan Performante, which was the high-performance version of the earlier Huracan. Now you get it in the regular model. Not that there's anything regular about this car. The Huracan Evo Coupe does 0 to 60 in about 2.5 seconds, and the Spider is probably only slightly slower. The base price is around $290,000, but things get far more expensive with options. This one is probably around $350,000 as it's configured, and the top speed is just over 200 miles an hour. This really seems like the best Huracan yet, which is what I said about the last one and the one before that. But it's hard to argue with this car's ultimate status, at least on paper. The numbers are amazing and the look is incredible. And today, I'm going to show you the rest. First, I'm going to take you on a tour of the Huracan Evo Spider. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it. And then I'm going to give it a Doug score. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Huracan with getting in, and that means starting with the key, which has a couple of interesting quirks. One is the buttons. You have a lock button on the top, of course, and unlock on the bottom, but the middle button opens the trunk with a silhouette of the Huracan with its trunk open, which is a nice little touch. I also like that the key has the Lamborghini logo on it, of course, but it's at the end, unlike most keys, where it's just sort of in the middle, which adds an extra dimension of coolness to the Huracan key. And next up, the next interesting thing is actually getting into the Huracan, because the door handle doesn't look like a typical door handle. So how do you use it? Well, it turns out you push the front part of the door handle and then the back part pops open, and then you can pull the door open. Once you know that, it's actually pretty easy to do. You can get into your Lambo. And next we move into the Huracan, where there are quite a few quirks and features in this interior. The most notable new feature is this big screen in the middle of everything. In the outgoing Huracan, the only real screen was in the gauge cluster area. There was a tiny center screen, but it didn't do much, and you mostly had buttons and switches in the center. And that meant that the passenger didn't really have the ability to easily adjust the audio system, since they couldn't see the readout. They couldn't really do anything with the navigation system. So this new center screen is a big deal for the Huracan for the 2020 model year. Now, with regards to this interior and this screen, once again, hexagons are a big theme. This has been something I've talked about in my prior Huracan videos, and it comes back here, including on this new screen, where you see on the home screen itself, you have many different hexagons to go to many different menus throughout the infotainment system. You also have hexagons in the controls to turn everything on and off. For example, here I am in the controls for the automatic wipers, and you can see the toggle switch is a hexagon, and in fact, it's a hexagon within a hexagon. They're really committed to this hexagon thing. You also have more hexagons pretty much anywhere you turn in this screen. For example, if you want to go to the radio, you can see that the diagram for that is a hexagon inside a hexagon inside a hexagon. But maybe my very favorite hexagon in this infotainment screen is the home button. In a lot of cars, it's like a picture of a house or of the car. In this, it's a hexagon, of course, because what else would it be? Now, I have to say, I did find one major drawback of this new screen situation, and that's the volume control. In order to turn the stereo volume up or down, you actually have to press this little speaker, and then you tap the screen to turn it up or down. So the volume control is not a knob or a switch like in virtually every other car. Instead, it's a two-step process. And you don't even have a volume control on the steering wheel, so it's not like the driver has this any easier. Everybody has to do the tap and then multiple taps for the volume. This is insanity. It goes against basically every rule of ergonomics in a car, but this is also a Lamborghini. You may be listening to the engine instead of the radio, so maybe it doesn't matter. But if you want to turn on the radio, that's how you have to adjust the volume. Now, other than that volume situation, I will say I don't really have any major complaints with this screen. It certainly isn't as good as the very best infotainment systems from Mercedes-Benz, Tesla, Volvo, but this is a supercar, and it works really well for a supercar. Surprisingly responsive to your touch, intuitive, well laid out, easy to use. This is a pretty good infotainment system, and it really does help modernize the interior of the Huracan. Those old school buttons in the outgoing model really did this car no favors. The screen is a big upgrade. But anyway, next we move on to the other interesting quirks and features in the Huracan, and I want to start with starting it. The start button in this car is underneath this red, dramatic looking cover. You flip that up and then you can press the start button and turn it on. Although it's worth noting you don't actually have to flip up the cover. You can also just push your finger through the start button and turn it on that way in case you're feeling especially lazy and you don't want to lift up your red button cover. Now, as for the gear selector situation, this car has a rather interesting one. When you turn on the car, it's in neutral. If you want to put it in drive and go forward, you pull on the right paddle, the upshift paddle, and that will put the car in basically first gear and you can drive away. If you want to put the car in park, there's a little button in the center console. You press P and that puts it in park. If you want to put it in manual mode, press the button below that. It says M and then you're in manual mode and you can shift gears yourself using the paddles. The weirdest part though is reverse. If you want to put this car in reverse, there's like a little handle in the center console. You pull up on this handle and then you're in reverse. I guess Lamborghini wants you to be absolutely certain you want to go into reverse, and so it's quite a bit of a different process than the other buttons and paddles in the gear selector. And next up we move on to the roof, because this car is a convertible and I know you'll want to know how the roof goes down. There's a little switch inside the center console and there's a diagram of a Huracan with the roof going up and down. If you push forward on that switch, the roof will go down and it's pretty quick. Take a look. Now, next to that little switch that will drop the roof, you also have a button with like a window on it. That is not the power windows on the side of the car. Instead, that controls the window behind the seats. This is a wind deflector, and if you have it up, wind will kind of go over the windshield and over that window, and you won't really have wind in your hair. If you put down that window, then you will have the full open air experience and you'll get kind of a windier feel in the cabin, and you can choose which one you want to do. Interestingly, in order to put the wind deflector down, you actually push up on this button, so it's a little counterintuitive. Push up for down and then it goes down, and if you want it to come back up, you pull down on the button and then it comes up. Oddly, this is the same way that the power windows operate. If you want them to go down, you push the switch upwards, and if you want the windows to come up, you pull back on the switch or you pull it down and the windows go up. It's an odd way to do it, but that's how they've done it here. Now, when you want the roof to go up in the Huracan, of course, it's the reverse of the procedure I showed you before. You just pull on the little roof button in the middle, and then it goes up. Again, pretty quick. Take a look. Now, one cool thing about that rear window wind deflector behind the seats is that you can put it up or down even if you have the roof up. So that way, if you want to just kind of create a little breeze through the interior, but you don't want to put the roof all the way down, you can lower that wind deflector with the roof up, and then you get some more air coming through. That's pretty cool. And next up, another interesting feature of this car. If you look on the windshield behind the rear view mirror, you will see there's a camera there facing out. This is not a dash cam. Instead, it's a telemetry camera. So when you're on the racetrack in this car, you can turn on that camera and monitor your laps, and then you can watch it later and kind of see where you were good or where you were bad, whatever. That's not that unusual. A lot of modern performance cars are adding cameras for that purpose, but the cool thing is this car also has a second camera. It's between the seats in the middle in the interior, and it's kind of angled towards the driver's area and the steering wheel. And with that camera running, you can watch your hand positioning and your gear changes and your hand movement, and then you can watch that later and try to improve your lap time. So you have a 2-camera system in this car for when you want to go on the racetrack, which is really cool. And next up, we move on to another interesting quirk in this interior, which is the turn signal operation, which is quite interesting. It's on the left spoke of the steering wheel, and it's just a little switch. You push the switch to the left to turn on the left turn signal, you push it to the right to turn on the right turn signal, and you push it in the middle to cancel the turn signals. Of course, they'll also cancel if you go around a turn. This is similar to how it is in a motorcycle, but different from pretty much any other car. There are a few other cars that have the turn signal mounted on the steering wheel. They don't have a switch like that. And next up, in the vicinity of that turn signal switch, right above it, you have another interesting item. That button is for the high beams. If you have your headlights on, you press that button, you can turn on your high beams. If they're off, you can just flash your high beams. Now, on the other side of the steering wheel, you also have a rather unorthodox control, and that would be for the wipers. You can see you have another switch that turns on the wipers and adjusts their frequency, and then the button above that turns on the windshield washer. The theory with putting all this stuff on the steering wheel is that Lamborghini wants you to focus on driving while you're in this car and not removing your hands from the wheel if you're going really high speeds. So putting this stuff on the steering wheel, it's all in easy reach of your thumb while you're holding onto the steering wheel. One other interesting steering wheel item in the Huracan is at the base of the steering wheel, and that's where you can switch between drive modes. You have 3 different ones. You have Strada, which means street in Italian, just sort of the normal mode. Then you have Sport, which is sport mode, and then you have Corsa, which is race mode. Now, as you switch between them, some interesting things happen. The main thing you notice is in the gauge cluster. In Strada, it looks pretty normal. Then you go into Sport, and you can see it gets a little more angry and aggressive. And then in Corsa, it changes completely so that it emphasizes your RPMs and your gear rather than your speed, which isn't as important when you're on the racetrack. But the most important thing that happens when you go into Corsa is the change in the exhaust. Take a listen to how this car sounds in Corsa. Now, aside from what happens in this car when you change drive modes, there's nothing particularly interesting in the gauge cluster compared to the outgoing Huracan. It's all pretty similar. In order to cycle through the little menus on the right, you press this little button on the side of the steering wheel, and it'll show you various different pieces of car information, like your tire pressure and that sort of thing. Nothing particularly interesting here compared to the outgoing Huracan. Next up, though, I do have to say I love the toggle switches in this car. I showed you this briefly before, but above the center screen in the center control stack, you have these 7 toggle switches that do various things. They roll up and down the window, put on the hazard lights, but I just love how they look and feel. They make this car feel so much more special than a normal car with boring normal buttons, and it's really cool that they have this. One of the toggle switches controls the axle lifting system. Most supercars now have something like this. You push this little toggle switch, and then the front end will lift up a few inches off the ground to help you clear steep driveways so you don't scrape the front of your low car. And the other thing worth noting about the Huracan is that it has a rather unusual sun visor. Instead of most cars where you push the sun visor out, in this one you pull it towards you, which is unorthodox, but it works with the shape of the windshield. The weird thing here is how tiny the sun visor is, incredibly small, but you do have a little mirror on it so you can look at yourself as you drive your Lambo. And next up, one more item worth noting in the interior of the Huracan. In the driver's footwell, you have little buttons that allow you to open up the engine cover and the trunk lid for the front trunk. We'll start in back with the engine cover. Now, when you get back here, you quickly discover that the term engine cover is actually kind of optimistic for what this really is, because when you open this up, you quickly see that you don't really get to see a lot of engine back here. The bulk of the engine is contained further forward in the car, but it's underneath where the top goes down, and so it's pretty much kind of covered in place in order to have the top be able to rest on top of it when it's down. So this is what you get access to. It's not quite the same as checking out your Lambo V10, but at least you can see something. Now, one other thing I absolutely love about this car is the placement of the exhaust. I think it is fantastic that they're so high up, kind of right in the middle. They really look like jet engine afterburners or something. They look so cool back here, and it really kind of feeds into the hype and the craziness and the insanity of this car, putting those giant exhaust outlets right there. And next up we move on to another important exterior feature of this car, and that would be its styling. Now, this car is still unmistakably a Huracan. It looks quite a bit like the outgoing model, but it has been modernized and revised for 2020 to become the Huracan Evo. You especially see that up front, where the front end is more aggressive and kind of angrier looking than the regular Huracan before. But really, it's just been kind of revised and tweaked to the point where you'd really only notice the changes if the two cars were parked next to each other, or if you're a big Huracan fan. Now, personally, I don't really see a problem with that. The Huracan still looks modern and cool and aggressive and daring. I think these changes help keep it looking fresh, but it didn't really need a full redesign just yet, since this look is still pretty exciting. And next up, another interesting quirk worth noting about the Huracan. In Lamborghini's official naming, the word Huracan has an accent over the second A. You can see here on the owner's manual that there's an accent there. The problem is that in Lamborghini's official cool Huracan script, there's nowhere to put that accent, so they place a little mark between the A and the N that's supposed to be that accent. That's something most people probably won't notice, but it's a nice little piece of attention to detail, and it keeps Lamborghini's naming consistent even with this cool Huracan font. But wait a second, let's go back to the owner's manual for a second. The accent is on the first A in Huracan, but in the door sill, it's on the second A, and they've repeated that everywhere. The floor mat, you have the accent over the second A. The technology, when the screens turn on, it says Huracan with the accent over the second A. Did they mess that up? Is that possible? Who am I to explain the actions of the Italians? And next up, another interesting item worth noting on the outside of this car, you can only see with the roof down, and that would be at the top of the windshield frame. You can see it says Huracan Spider. This is a nice little quirk that most people won't notice, but when you roll up to your favorite restaurant on your Huracan Spider and park it right in front with the roof down, this way everybody knows exactly what you're driving. And next we move on to the front of the Huracan Evo Spider, where there are a couple of details worth noting. One is that this car still has some of my very favorite turn signals in the entire car industry. When the car is running, you can see it has these very distinctive running lights up front, but then when you put on the turn signal, the signal replaces the entire running light in like 4 different pillars of light, and it looks very cool, very distinctive, and I've always loved how that looks in this car. But next we move up front, and by that I mean in to the front trunk, which you can pop open with the key. And when you open it up, you will discover a couple of interesting items in here. For one thing, it isn't really all that big. Compared to the Ferrari 488 and the Audi R8, this is a rather small cargo area, even for a supercar, so don't expect to take too much cargo in this thing. But another interesting thing you'll find in here is all these zippered black bags. Over on the left and right, you have 2 kind of kidney-shaped bags that are Velcroed into the cargo area, and these are for tire changing. You have a tire inflator in here and kind of other tire changing tools. My very favorite, in the bag on the left, they give you white gloves in case you ever have a flat tire with your Huracan and you want to change the tire by the side of the road. You have these white Lamborghini gloves you can do it with. Seems ridiculous. The other interesting black bag in here is this larger one. When you open this up, you can see what appears to be wind deflectors, which is kind of odd because I already showed you that there's that power window wind deflector behind the seats. So what exactly is this? Well, it turns out that you're supposed to put these wind deflectors deflectors over kind of on the side next to the seats in case you really want your wind to be deflected. And that way it will really keep the wind out of your hair and kind of diminish all the buffeting from wind going over the car and the seatbelts and that sort of thing. So there's an extra auxiliary set of wind deflectors if you want the roof down, but you really don't want any wind. And so those are the quirks and features of the Lamborghini Huracan Evo Spider. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the Huracan Evo Spider. This is the first Huracan Spider I've reviewed. I've done the coupes before, so I'm kind of interested in checking this out. Now, one thing worth noting, this car has a rear wheel steering system. The Performante did also, but in this car, apparently it's been really revised to just be dramatically improved and better. Everybody I've talked to says this steers better than the Performante. The sound is certainly out of control. This feels way louder than the regular Huracan. It could be because it's a convertible and so you can just hear it better, but that's an unbelievable sound. As always with the Huracan, the shifts are just instantaneous, incredibly quick, and there's no like shock to it. They're just in the next gear. You don't have to worry about getting slammed around like in some of the old school cars like the Aventador, frankly, with its single clutch transmission. Now, one thing that a few people mention about the Spider version of this car is that there's a lot less headroom in the Spider. And I found that to be true as well. If you're sitting here with the top up, you're kind of scrunched down if you're a taller person. And right now, even here with the top down, I'm sort of looking at the windshield rim at traffic lights and that sort of thing. It's really pretty abrupt in your face. The ride quality in this car is punishing. It's not intended to be a smooth grand touring car, which is good because it isn't. It's tolerable, and I think there are those among us who could daily drive this and be okay. But for me, I like something a little bit more comfortable if I'm going to use it frequently. Of course, the trade-off is that harsh ride gives you stiff suspension and better handling, so that's what you want for a real sports car. Now, in terms of acceleration, you drop a gear. This car is so fast. Monstrous. You know, the entire time I've been around this car all day filming it and now driving it, I just keep thinking, how is it possible that they are ever going to improve on this car? You know, I drove the original Huracan and I thought it was the best of these cars. Then the Performante comes out, it's even faster, it's even sharper. This now feels like the Performante, maybe even a little bit quicker. How are they going to make a Performante of this? What happens to the next generation? This car is at its peak, it feels like. And of course, the thing that I love the most about the Huracan is the steering precision and the steering feel. I feel like Ferrari is now on that level only with the Pista. But the 488 was no Huracan when it came to steering precision. And this car continues that tradition. It's just so sharp when you're going around fast corners. It just feels so incredibly sharp. And so that's the Lamborghini Huracan Evo Spider. This car is essentially the new Huracan, and it's amazing. I think it's probably even better than the Huracan Performante, which was also amazing. The performance is unreal. The styling is daring and eye-catching, and the excitement this car generates is unlike almost anything else on the road. And now it's time to give the Evo Spider a Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the Huracan Evo Spider is gorgeous. Not the most beautiful, but very attractive, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Acceleration is unreal, 0 to 60 in like 2.5 seconds, and it gets a 10 out of 10. Handling is among the very best, and it gets a 10 out of 10. Fun factor is huge, though it's a little too tame for a perfect score, and it gets a 9 out of 10. Cool factor is really good, but it's not quite on the level of the craziest hypercars. It gets an 8 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 45 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. The Huracan Huracan Evo Spider is well equipped and it gets a 6 out of 10. Comfort is normal for a car like this and it gets a 4 out of 10. Quality is very high as the interior is top notch and it gets an 8 out of 10. Practicality is average for this segment and it gets a 2 out of 10. Finally, value, which is fine. These are getting harder to justify considering they're very similar to a normal Huracan which came out years ago. It gets a 6 out of 10 for a total daily score of 26 out of 50. Added up and the Doug score is 71 out of 100, which places it here against rivals. The new Huracan Evo ties the old Huracan, losing a point in value but adding one for fun factor. The Huracan is still a point behind the Ferrari 488 Pista, but the Pista is more expensive. The Huracan Evo Spider is a fantastic car and it's a great update to a legendary Lamborghini.